Welcome back to Dave Knows Comics for another How to Draw session. Today's episode is The Hulk. Alright, so let's start. Now, this is a viewer request, so Yoda Date, this goes out to you. Now, when it comes to drawing the Incredible Hulk, he's pretty fun for a series of reasons. Now, as you can see, I'm doing the pre-drawing, the gesture drawing, doing the crosshatch on the face. And the reason why the Hulk interests me is because there's a lot of options when it comes to drawing the Hulk. A lot of things that you have to decide on. You know, he's one of those characters that there is something that, you know, when you really draw him a lot that you have to decide one way or the other what your choices are. No, I don't like the way this is going. I want to make this a little more interesting. I was going to just do, in my head I was picturing just looking straight into the camera, just staring right at the viewer kind of thing, but I figured it'd be a little more interesting to give him a little more of an angle. I kind of forgot that because I just wanted to do that hulking, you know, roar muscle pose, but you know, let's just do something slightly different, make it a little more interesting. But yeah, so when it comes to drawing the Hulk, there are choices you have to make, and a lot of people when they draw him, they just make a guy who is green. He's just a regular size guy who's green, or he's a muscle guy, regular muscle size guy, but he's green, and that's really not doing the Hulk justice because there is so much more you can do with him, and so much I think you're supposed to do with him when you're drawing him. So one of the first things, and because he's so large, and the way I draw him, he's supposed to be really large and super muscular, not regular proportions. He's supposed to be super muscular guy. So that's why I'm doing a gesturing, because you can kind of forget to. You might slip into default. And while I've been doing the gesturing normally, I'm doing it here because I want to especially make sure that I get the proportions right and don't slip into just drawing a default average size human being when I'm trying to draw the Hulk. Because I think drawing the Hulk right means giving him bizarrely big muscles. And that's one decision right there. Now, so not only did I mention some people just draw him as a regular size green guy, he's just, you know, proportionally regular proportions, and he's just slightly larger when he's standing next to other characters. You just notice he's bigger, but he's regular proportions, he's just larger. I don't choose to do that. I want to give him muscles. But even further still, some people, now I'm just going to give him really, really big muscles, really, really big hulking, bulky, Hulk-like muscles, where other people are going to draw him with more muscles, or they might draw him the same size, but they will give like little muscles that normal people don't have. And one of the reasons why you do that, and while I'm not opposed to doing that, and I've done it before, is you give him a lot of little muscles, because since his arms and his torso are so massively huge and so massively larger proportions than other characters, you kind of have to fill that empty space because it's kind of flat. So I don't mind it. I find that it adds to the mass if you leave some of the space there, some of the thing. Oh, and right here I realize I keep going into this like very boring place, and so I'm not going to change it up too much, because when I draw bigger guys, bigger, larger than life characters, super large characters, I kind of like them being stationary or standing still. It makes them seem more massive if they're more still, I think. But still, nonetheless, I don't want to make it too still and stagnant and boring, so I decided I'm going to have his arms, you know, come out a little bit. He's going to have a little more of a stance, a little more of a pose than just standing there. But so going back to the muscle thing, some people, when they draw muscles that are super large, they add more muscles. So characters like the Hulk, and even to an extent Thor, they might add, you know, little muscles that people don't really have. For me, my biggest gauge for muscles, and even though I'm nowhere near superhero proportions or swole or anything like that, I think everyone should just use their own muscles. You know, look in the mirror or just feel. Like, flex as hard as you can and just kind of feel where your own actual muscles go. And just imagine that if they were superhero sized, you know, supersized, where would they, you know, what would they look like? You know, just to get the idea of where the lines are in the form. And you'll notice you have a couple of muscle groups, but some artists draw special little ones just to fill this negative space, which I don't plan on doing today. Again, I think I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I will a little to the rib section for these side muscles or ribs or whatever they are. That is a little exaggerated. I'm gonna exaggerate that. I don't know why I like that, but I think I do. I seen it on, you know, He-Man drawings when I was a kid, so that might be one of the reasons why I'm still adopting it today, because I'm used to it. since birth. Okay, so going back to the proportion size. So now I'm going back to the Hulk. So when we look at him, like now you can see what I'm talking about. Now that I fleshed him out for the most part, his head you can see is smaller than the rest of his body. Now this is one of those other decisions you got to make, or the other things to be aware of, the other choices and issues that you might have. Real quick, here's another one. His hair. For some reason, I really like it when the Hulk has no hair on the sides of his head and just has hair on the top. I like that look. I don't know why. Maybe it's because it looks like he's so big he grew and his hair didn't, so his hair just takes up that much of his head. But either way, I like this look for the Hulk. I like it when he has no hair on the sides. It's just the style I like. Now I'm working on the face. But yeah, so something to be aware of when drawing the Hulk is how do you make it look like he's massively swole and not just a guy with a small head? That's a tough one. So when you're building his proportions and making his body super large, how do you draw that? So let me talk about the face, and then I'll show you on the neck. I'll talk about the neck a little more. Okay, so when it comes to this Hulk, when it comes to drawing the Hulk's face, another big decision that I like is when you draw his face, I think you should make him look almost gorilla-like. And there's certain things that go along with that. For one, I give him this pronounced Cro-Magnon-esque brow. I really like that look for the Hulk. I think that's very important. Also give him this, I'm giving him a gaunt on his face, a little gaunt, that sunken in cheek look, which some people do, some people don't. But the reason why I do it is so I can, and right now I'm realizing that the jaw is a little high. I need to make the jaw lower. So I'm just going to erase the jawline and make this jaw come down more. All right, so the reason why I draw, because I want his head facing down, so his chin will tuck in a little more, but I don't want it that much. So one of the reasons why I do this is because drawing the Hulk, when I draw the sides here, I'm going to make that jaw a little even lower still. Fine line here, but I'm going to make... I can make the gaunt on the sides of his mouth. I can pronounce them a little more. It's going to add to that Cro-Magnon gorilla-like feature, because I think the Hulk, when he's at his best, he's really just a big gorilla, like a big green gorilla. So the gaunt here on the sides, it really works for this. And here's the other part that makes him gorilla-like, having his mouth lower and having this lip line, that vertical line from his nose to the lip, that really helps to add to that gorilla-like appearance. So. And I'm going to give him this. It's kind of like this kind of lip I do draw where it's almost like the lip itself has muscles. I kind of like that, so I'm going to be doing that for the Hulk for sure. Grit teeth for sure. All right, so regular lip, but then so you can see me bulging out right by the sides, but then. Okay, but underneath the lip, it's a lip muscle. I don't know what else to call it, but so underneath his lower lip and in between and above his chin, right in between, there's this extra muscle there. So to really show you that he has muscle. So I guess I am adding a few extra muscles here, but not that much. Okay, so all right, moving right along. Here we have. I'm going to go back to the arms. Now this is a fairly plain body. Again, I know that, so it's time to. You got to add some texture to it. So I'm gonna add this forearm line here. Also got to add abs. And another thing for me, just a strange thing the way I am. I prefer when the Hulk doesn't have a six pack. He's got to have some ab muscles, but not the full six. I tend not to give him the full six for whatever reason. It's. Like, I think with the abs, if I give him a full six-pack, he looks too defined. And while I know the Hulk is this muscle guy, I don't want him to be, a cut dude. I want him to be a bulky guy. Bulky muscle. All right, so while I do like the toupee look, if for lack of a better term for a Hulk, that wasn't doing it for me. I need to fix his hair up a little bit more. Okay, so... All right, getting prepared for this one. Just got to erase a little more. Okay, so now I'm going to make it more sweeping. More in his face. Kind. I don't give him the part in the middle. I just leave it a little piece of hair floating on top. So there you go. That's more what I'm looking for. All right, so there you go. Now I can make it. I mean, the drawback to this, when you give them not as much hair, you can't make it as wild and crazy appearing as you can. I mean, you can do it a little bit, but it's not as you can't like really make them look all manic and all that stuff like that. But I just prefer this look. There's certain superheroes where I think you have where people have their preference to what kind of hair they prefer them with. So it's an odd thing to think about, but yeah. All right, so here's another way I do intend to add texture or break up the blahness of just his regular chest or his giant massive muscles. Is I do these like split lines, which some comic book characters and some people in real life actually have. They're almost they have these splits. I don't know what they're called, but for a Hulk, it's a good way to when you have a massive chest like this. It's a good way to break up the neutral space, if you will. All right. See, I mean, arms. Well, you can add more. I could definitely add more lines into it. I'm good with this because they're very simplistic, but yet the arms with the bicep and the shoulders, they do add enough lines already. So I don't feel the need to add too many more lines to it. Plus, the shadowing is another way that I choose to break up the monotony of his gigantic muscles and all this negative space. Here I'm doing some splits in the shoulders, so I take that back. You can add some texture to the shoulders. I'm going to add some shoulders. But the biceps and the forearms, beyond what you see right here, I'm not really going to add too much. I'm not going to add unnecessary muscles. For Hulk, I do like putting like certain splits in like his shoulders and his chest. Maybe the extra by the ribs, but that's about it. Okay, so the Hulk. Now I got the pencils really where I want it. This is kind of where I want it. And as you can see, he's standing mostly stationary, but he's got more of an interesting, slightly interesting stance. Just changed a few subtle things, but it made him look a little more. Oh, and also, let's talk about these forehead lines, because Hulk is angry, so you got to really put the stress lines in his forehead coming from the middle of his brow. But yeah, so you can see this pose while his chin is tucked in a little bit and his arms are open a little more. It adds a little bit when you have such a massive character and he's got this pose down to you. So it says a little bit more than if I just had him standing with his hands directly straight down at his sides and his chin forward and his face looking directly forward. This has a little more attitude towards it. All right, so I'm good with this, so it's time to start penciling. And again, I'm inking. And as you know, I like to start with the eyes. When I'm inking or I'm finalizing. I kind of feel like if you make the face right, you can kind of forget about everything else, or everything else will fit into play, or it'll motivate you to make everything else right. So I usually start at the eyes and outward because that's the most important part of the face. And if you screw up there, then you can just throw it out and say, oh, forget it. But if you draw the rest of the body and then screw up the face later, it's like, oh man, I did all this work. So I figure start at the face. And also, again, I like how it dictates everything. I think it sets the pace for how you're going to draw and how the drawing's going to come out. Okay, so let's get into that. All right, so we're working on this lower lip muscle. And now, another thing to keep in mind, since the Hulk is such a massive figure, you can get away and see I'm working on those the sides of that gaunt around his mouth, making him a little more pronounced, bulge him out a little more, give him more to that gorilla-like appearance. But when it comes to the Hulk, you got to be aware, since he is a bulkier character, or you be aware that you have the option to make thicker lines or to do more with the lines, weight the lines a little more, instead of just having a very, very thin line. And if you do that, be consistent with it, but it, again, speaks volumes. So instead of just having one straight line, you can add a little more texture to it, a little more character to it, double over, sketch, get a very sketchy thing. Like here, adding additional strokes towards the sideline, just so it doesn't, of his neck, so it doesn't look so boring. But you could get away with it because there's so much distance. If the character was small in proportions and his muscles weren't as superhumanly Hulk-like gigantic, the lines would be closer together. So if you add too much to it, then it's going to give it a very scratchy kind of look. But if they're spaced out, and it's not even by a whole lot of room, but spacing them out just a little bit gives you more room to play, and it makes it look less scratchy and sketchy, even though you are using a lot of strokes and, doing a kind of rough sketch kind of look to it. See, like with hair is a perfect example because you can do this kind of, going over the same line and just kind of scratching at it, or sketchy and just, jotting down real quick and blurring it and, like just scribbling it down. And it's fine because it looks like hair. If you did that for a smaller character, then it looks like you're doing that kind of style for everything. But see here, right there, like on this right side of the muscle, I went it over a couple times. But on this massive character, the Hulk, it doesn't look like that's what I'm doing. All right, now going over the collarbone. Now with the collarbone, I have these really high points at the side on the ends of the collarbone. I'm doing that on purpose because again, it's the Hulk, so he's going to look more massive. And back to what I was saying about the head thing. How do you make a guy look like he's got massive body and not just a guy with a tiny head? And there are more of those stretch lines. Well, one of them is this. His neck's got a taper, but it's got to be bulgy. If his neck is bulgy, then it looks like he's supporting it, and even more scratch lines. Because without it, it looks weird now because I'm doing it so much. But if you have a really bulgy, muscular neck that slowly tapers into this tiny head to support this head, then you realize that his head's a normal size, but his body's big. It helps to indicate that. If he was just having a tiny head, it would not bulge out. It would taper inward. It would be skewing in, and that would make it look like he is a guy with a tiny head. This, when it's all bulgy and all that, and he's got all these like neck veins and everything, and this, neck tendons and all that stuff supporting his massive head, and they're all flaring and bulging, and you're like, oh, this guy's got a big head, but he's got a way bigger body, and that's how it comes across. All right, so here we go. And again, working on these stretch lines. Now, for the Hulk, since he's bulky and bulgy, I made his pectoral muscles a little more rounded, but I think I made it a little too round, so here I am scratching out easy and making it more a little square, a little blockier. Yeah, okay. Okay. Just taking a look at things. Every once in a while, it's good to pause and just take a look. All right. Now these lines. Now these splits, as I said, as I call them, they're interesting because you can't draw too much attention to them because then they look like they're taking up too much room on there. You got to do them just subtle enough where you don't really think about it. You draw them, but they're subtle. Now I'm gonna add a little more shadow to it. I'm gonna add a little thicker lines to it, but it's just something to be aware that you can't exaggerate them too much. And then there's those side muscles, whatever you want to call them. And here we go, Mr. Marker. So now, again, thicker lines, use them to your advantage. And when it comes to a big character, they're going to cast a shadow. So when you add a thicker line towards the bottom, it's just going to naturally look like shadow. The key is, again, consistency. And remembering that he's super large, you got to make the shadow lines correspond with him. Now, I'm just doing this to get a rough outline, but when it gets to the shadow time, if parts of his body are going to be larger, they're going to protrude more and therefore cast more of a shadow. Yeah, so, yeah, there we go. Right now I'm using the brush side. There's a brush side to this. So I'm using, brush marker style, which I really like brush markers. I think they're really cool. So I'm using this to cast a little bit more of a shadow. So notice how the lines taper in and out, and they kind of go from being deep to being thin. So, and here you go. So same thing with the pectoral. Got to swoop them out. Swoop it out. He's going to have a much larger chest, and it's going to cast a much bigger shadow. So got to make sure you keep that in mind. And these little side planes next to the abs. This also helps to break up the monotony on the neutral space of his gigantic body. Okay. All right, Alright, now switching back to the other. Yeah, now I'm going to the side muscles. And what's really cool is, well, when you draw them with pencils, the side muscles don't necessarily look great, but when you use the marker or when you use like a brush or something like that, they look pretty cool. Then they just kind of look like a little pattern that's over on the side. And now I'm looking around where I want to go next. Yeah, and the bicep. Anything that's like a circle, any circular or rounded shape works really well with the brush because it'll make one end thinner automatically if you press on the brush the right way. And that's kind of what you want, so it adds a little bit of difference where the lines switch from being thick to thin. Makes it look more realistic. Alright, so now I have a smaller brush pen, and smaller pens are good for hair, because that's what these do too, especially since these brush pens, they change thicknesses going. You can start off dark and then, or thick, and then as you move and swirl the pen out, lift it off the page, you can make it look thin, which is really good for creating strands of hair. Also using it to create shadow, and again, under the ear, under the jaw, we're going to get some shadow. His chin may be tucked into his chest a little bit, but he's still going to cast a little bit of a shadow. And also using the marker to add more shadow to the middle brow that is furrowed out, as well as his laugh lines coming out from his nose. Yeah, there we go. And adding to that gaunt under his cheekbones. And again, you can get away with it because Hulk is a thicker character, so you can add a little more weight to his proportions. Add a little more weighted lines or thicker lines to parts of his, the lower parts of his face especially, so it creates more of a shadow, so you get the idea that it's a little more pronounced. Alright, yeah, there we go. I'm just going to use this marker to create some more lines in the neck. Again, I want to really do my line work so it stresses, and I'm going to do it for the splits, as I told you I was going to work on this area some more. Using the line work with the brush pen specifically to reaffirm, to adjust or re-acknowledge certain lines in the body. Because it tapers out so well, and because the Hulk has a lot of thick lines the way I drew them, I'm going to need that to justify these thinner lines. So by using this thicker marker, or brush marker, I'm going over and just taking all these thick lines and making them taper down thinner, and then taking these thinner lines and backing them up a little bit with the marker, the brush marker, to thicken them up in some places. So because the way it tapers out, it's tapering out the thick lines, but it's also tapering into the thinner lines. And you definitely want to use it for those ends of the collarbone. And since I'm using it for those purposes, I got to make sure when I use it, I have to go real fast to lift it off the page to give me those tapering out lines. And right here, I realized that the way the arm is positioned, the elbow shouldn't be facing me because so much of the bicep is facing the camera that having the elbow do it too is kind of weird. So I had to rotate this and fix that up. Something I didn't catch in the pre-drawing. Caught it now, though. And again, I kind of want to make these lines a little bit darker here because I want to make them really protrude, and if they're really protruding, then they're going to cast a lot more of a shadow. And I'm even going to do some rendering here on this side, which is something I normally don't do with a marker. So yeah, just to re-up and reinforce the idea that these muscles are really bulgy and protrudy, you got to cast more of a shadow. Okay, now these are those forearm lines. They extend down from the tricep into the forearm. Okay. Working on some more shadow here. because naturally this tricep line is going to cast a shadow. Shadow of the shoulder muscle. And just kind of finalizing things here. Now, I'm going to do some rendering. I know I don't do a lot of rendering on this channel so far in the drawings you've seen, but I really do like rendering, so I'm just kind of adding it up a little more. And I normally don't render, and render is drawing these little lines. I normally don't do this for the Hulk just because he's so massive. I think it's weird to have these thin little lines here, but they can work for your advantage. So, especially here. Now, the way I put it is that rendering works good to create an effect that looks like a shadow if you don't really want to shadow the area. And even though we're going to be coloring it, and I'm going to be adding the shadows in the coloring process too, it still works. The rendering still works to add an additional layer. And you can render it in multiple directions, like I'm doing here for this in between the ab area, as well as underneath the arm. And it's good for creating that kind of shadow. So it's pretty good. Now, if you're new to rendering, it can look like I'm just going, zigzagging across the paper, but I'm not. Once you get good at it and once you start practicing it a lot or doing it a lot, you'll know how to render and create these lines. But in the beginning, I always suggest drawing it. It's, drawing each individual line. It's something that my dad talked about when I was a kid. And so it may look like someone just sloppily just drawing these little lines, but if you're not good at it, or if you're not careful, you can get too crazy with it. So you might have to just take your time, draw each line, as tedious as that might seem. But I think if you do that, it's a good way to start getting the motions down, and it'll actually help you, I think. I'm also putting rendering here on the face, which is something that I normally don't do, at least not like this. But again, because of his size, the Hulk size, I think it actually works that he has something that's normally reserved, like for the shadow of under an arm or on the side of an arm. He's got that on his side of his face, because even big shadows are small in the Hulk. But you see how that rendering on the side of his face, how it makes the front of his face pop out a little more, and also adds what rendering is also really good for is creating a third-dimensional look to it. So now his face pops out a little bit more. If I had just covered that area black, it might not pop as much, or it might not look as three-dimensional. Okay. So here we go, getting into the you're really getting into the last stages of the character. Now, I know that I'm going to be doing a lot of coloring in the computer, so there's certain things I'm not worried about for now. Now I'm just worried about trying to finalize it with my line work, making sure things look good, and they do. So now I'm going to move on to Mr. Brush, not Mr. Brush pen or brush marker, but a real brush. And I'm using the Sumi ink here. Now the Sumi ink is a little more runny, a little more watery. It's not quite as robust as the Black India ink. Don't worry, I'll be taking care of that later though. So here we go. Now, working on the background, we're going to be using this thick brush here, and a combination of the thick brush and this tissue. The reason why I use a tissue is because it's good for smearing. And the best thing you could do, same thing with the body and the line work and everything, the different kinds of techniques you combine, the better it looks. Here, I'm going to actually add a little bit of the Black India ink here, because I want something a little bit darker. I don't want something as light for it. So I'm going to be using the brush to add the foundation layer, but then I'm going to be using the tissue to smear, to really smear this. Yeah, there you go. And it's the same thing like the rendering on the side of the face. You do this to make the character pop out. And since the Hulk has a lot of simple lines around him, this is going to be extra easy because I don't have to worry about little details like characters with, like trench coats or, a lot of guns or a lot of knives. You have little thin details you got to work around. It's kind of hard to do backgrounds like this because you end up always coloring outside the lines and then having to go back to adjust it with the whiteout marker. But still, so the Hulk's a lot easier because he's, doesn't have any doodads in his costume. He's just a big shirtless green dude. So it's going to be a lot easier for me to just color right up to the border and then smear outwards. So definitely going to use this technique for the Hulk right here because it's going to be so much easier for me to do. All right. Yeah, got to get on the arm. And yeah, now notice how that. Now I'm not done. I just got started with this, but notice how this little bit of ink smear is going to make them pop out. Even the parts that I did not touch with the brush because I'm smearing it outwards, it makes it a little gray looking. It's got that little gray effect, and therefore will be darker, and therefore the Hulk is popping out a bit more. So it works good to make him stand out. It works good. Now I'm going to color up to his hair. Let me get that down. Okay. Yeah. All right. Let's see where else I can go with this. Yeah, a little bit more. Now I'm just dipping. Now there, I just dipped the tissue in straight up because I cut out the middleman. Just try to speed this up a little bit more and get a different layer of effect. Yeah, it's all about doing different things. A big part that you kind of start thinking about, the more you draw, you realize that when you're drawing comic book style, the more you realize it is you want things to not look like a drawing, as ridiculous as it sounds. And I'm using the brush marker right now, the brush pen to hair. Forgot to actually color in his hair. I know it's green, but it's dark, and leave a little shine line, just like that. Looks good. Okay, so the thing to remember is when you really start really getting into drawing, and you want to, comic book style in particular, you usually don't want things to look like they're drawing, although some people do. And I'm just going to draw some strands of hair. I'm using a much thinner pen here. I'm using a .005 to draw a little bit of strands of hair in the shine line. And the best way to make something not look like it's a drawing is to use multiple techniques. If you combine different pieces of line work, pencil, and then on top of that ink, and then on top of that paintbrush, in certain parts and not in certain parts, it's harder to tell what technique you use, what particular style the person was using when they're looking at it, who doesn't know what they were, how they created the drawing. And that's good. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes you want something to blatantly look like a drawing. There's a lot of really sketchy kind of artwork, and I mean sketchy as in, it's very scribbly, or you can see the lines very well, and it's very clear that this person used a pencil, and that's a specific aesthetic, and if that's what you're going for, cool. And yeah, there's comic book art that does that, and it looks great. But for me, in this style of drawing, I'm definitely trying to get you to forget that this is a drawing. I don't want you to be aware so much of which individual techniques I use. Now, yeah, clearly I know anyone who looks at this is going to know this is drawing. They're not going to think this is real. They're not going to stare at this and think that it's a photograph. Photorealism, by the way, is very cool. But I don't want it to be where I don't want it to be to the case where you start noticing the drawing and the drawing lines more than you realize the character. I want you to think of this as a character first. Like when you first see it, the first thing that should pop out to you is like, whoa, it's the Hulk. Not, oh, look at the pencil work on that Hulk drawing, which I think is art. And I'm adding more rendering because I got it rendered onto the abs. But I'm not rendering as much or in as many different directions on the abs as I was on those side panels. Because the side panels, it's going to be darker, and I'm slowly, gradually lightening it, therefore making it look more 3D. Okay, but yeah, so, there's some paintings where they put the ink on very thick, and, it's textured and it's bumpy and you can see it. And that's cool. because that's what they want. That's the effect they're going for. However, for me, when you look at the painting, the first thing you think about is you can see the ink. While you might realize it's a flower, or a painting of a person, standing out somewhere, whatever you're thinking of, whatever it's supposed to be, you pay attention to the paint. You realize, well, that paint's coming out for real, and you almost want to touch it, and that kind of takes it away. With this drawing, the visual context for me is, I know it's weird because I'm telling you about it now, but when you're just looking at the drawing, if you've never seen it before, you just stare at it. I don't think at any point does it dawn on you to start thinking about the pencil work or the line work or the inks that I used or the markers or pens. You just look at the drawing and that's kind of it, and that's where you want. And for me, that is what I like doing. But, okay, so here we go. Here, I scanned it in digitally. Yes, I forgot to draw the pants of the Hulk. That was a mistake on my part. But here it is digitally. Now, I'm going to, as I said, color it digitally because I like coloring in the computer and adding the shade. And there you go. So here's the pantsless Hulk. But here it is, all the same. Here's your Hulk with some highlights and some shadow and some textures. And I really like the way this came out. You can see that with the shadow, the darker green, because green is one of those things I think really works well when you getting lighter and darker to blend. I think it blends a lot easier, where I think other colors don't have that advantage. Dark red and pink are I think stand out a little bit more than, they don't blend together as well as, let's say, green does. Okay, so there you go. Here's my drawing of the Incredible Hulk. But what about you guys? What else do you want to see me draw? Let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe right here to Dave Knows Comics. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.